Hey guys, I'm Tyson James, back with another midweek apologetics. There was once a group of blind men who came across an elephant, and this was a creature that they had never come across before. And so each man placed his hands on a different part of the elephant to find out what this creature was like. One man placed his hand on the trunk and said, "This animal is thick like a snake." One man placed his hand on an ear and said, "No, it seems kind of like a fan." Another felt the leg of the elephant and said, "I think it's a pillar, like a tree trunk." Still another placed his hand on the tail and said, "It's like a rope." Another put his hand on the side of the elephant and said, "It's more like a wall." And the one who felt the tusk said that it was hard and smooth, like a spear. The men could not agree on what this creature was like, and so they began to fight. This parable is meant to illustrate the limitations of our personal experience and our grasp of the truth. It comes from a religion which started 2,500 years ago called Jainism. I've always been super fascinated by Jainism, and so I'm very excited to be able to talk about it today. Many of you will probably be familiar with the Protestant Reformation, which started as an effort to correct some of the problematic features of Catholicism, and which eventually led to the formation of a group with a new identity, right, the Protestants. The rise of Jainism was very much the same, where instead of Catholicism, its target for reform was the preeminent institutional religion of the day in Asia, which is Hinduism. Jainism was actually part of the same movement that led away from Hinduism and started Buddhism. That was the religion that I dealt with in my video last week. As a religion, Jainism is actually pretty small. It only has about 4 or 5 million followers today. However, despite its being so small, it has an influence and ideological impact that is disproportionately large. At one point, the revered Hindu activist Gandhi, he was struggling with some aspects of religion, and he himself was mentored by a Jain whom he credited with helping him to overcome his ideological and intellectual doubts. Part of Gandhi's struggle was especially with the doctrine of ahimsa, or radical nonviolence. This is actually a central tenet of Jainism, which teaches that nonviolence is the only true path to salvation and liberation from attachment to the world and the cycle of rebirth. The central figure of Jainism is a man named Vardhamana, who was later known as Mahavira, which means great hero. Like the Buddha, Mahavira was raised in the lap of luxury. He was the son of a Raja, which is like a king or prince in India. He married a princess, and together they had a daughter. But at the age of 30, Mahavira decided that he no longer wanted to be attached to the things of this world, and he left everything behind, including his family, in order to pursue a life of complete asceticism, which is just giving up all of your material goods, and he was devoted to absolute pacifism. He was so committed to these principles that he actually rejected clothing, so he would wander from place to place naked in search of salvation. After 13 years of searching during a period of intense meditation, Mahavira was said to have achieved nirvana, or enlightenment, and release from the cycle of rebirth. Having overcome attachment to the world, he became known as Jina, which means the conqueror. And this is where Jainism gets its name, Jina Jainism. After 30 more years of teaching his methods for achieving nirvana, Mahavira performed the ultimate act of detachment and pacifism by dying of voluntary starvation. If you've seen my video on Buddhism, you will probably have already recognized several very close similarities between Mahavira and the Buddha. However, there are some very interesting differences that I'd like to point out. Unlike the Buddha, Mahavira tackled some of the most important metaphysical questions that the Buddha kind of ignored. Mahavira claimed that the universe is eternal and that there was no supreme creator who created and sustained it. In other words, Jainism is very much an atheistic religion. Also, Mahavira's consideration of women was almost the complete opposite of the Buddha. The Buddha thought that women could attain nirvana, but he was against them being part of the Sangha, or the religious community. Mahavira went the other way, and he said that women could not achieve nirvana until they were reincarnated as men because of their karma, but he was not against them being part of the religious community. For this reason, women have always been a huge part in preserving the Jainist traditions. Early on, Jainism split into two different groups, mainly because one group went north and one moved south, and so they developed the religion in different ways. One group is called the Digambaras, which literally means clothed with the sky. And as it suggests, they live naked, just like Mahavira did. The other group is called the Svetambaras, which means clothed in white, so they allow their followers to wear a simple white robe. So earlier on I mentioned that radical nonviolence was central to Jainism, and to give you an idea of how strictly they adhere to this principle, it should be noted that not only do Jains refuse to eat meat, which by the way is why many scholars believe that India is largely vegetarian today. But also they refuse to, for instance, walk on new paths or to walk in the dark because they don't want to accidentally injure other living beings. One of my religion professors told me that often Jains will practice regular spitting so as not to accidentally swallow or harm microorganisms. So I mentioned that, so this extreme form of nonviolence finds its most shocking expression in a ritual known as Salikhana, where, like Mahavira, the Jain devotee undertakes a voluntary ritual fast, leading to death by starvation. Some people might see this as internally contradictory, right? They are committed to nonviolence, and ritual starvation seems like violence against a living being, right? Namely oneself. But their principle is that one should refrain from violence against other beings. So really they are consistent and faithful in living out that belief through that ritual starvation. So where does Jainism go wrong? Well, I think Jainism fails in three ways: philosophically, scientifically, and theologically. We might say doctrinally, since it's an atheistic religion. So number one, philosophically. Jains make the claim that God does not exist, and there are a number of good philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Number one, the contingency argument, which the Jains have this idea that the universe must exist and could not be any different than it is. And this seems to me to be wildly implausible. It seems much more plausible that the universe could have not existed, or it could have been different than it is. And this implies that it needs some explanation for the way it is outside of itself. And most plausibly, that explanation is God. Number two, the fine-tuning argument. So the conditions of the universe are so precisely balanced for the existence of intelligent life that this cries out for an explanation. And the idea that these conditions must be the way that they are, or just happen to arise by chance, seems less likely than that they were the product of design by a transcendent designer. Number three, a moral argument. So we all seem to affirm that there are things which are good and bad, or right or wrong, which exist independently of our personal preferences. And so the most plausible explanation for that is a transcendent personal being whose very nature is perfect and serves to ground the existence of these morals. Another philosophical claim that Jains make is that the universe and everything in it is eternal. And we can know that this is false intuitively by and the impossibility of reaching an actual infinite through counting. So if we could never reach infinity by counting up from the present, so starting at 0 and you count up, you will never reach an actual infinite because you can always add another number, right? But if this is the case, then you also can't reach past infinity by counting down from 0. So related to time, if the universe is actually past eternal, then you would have to travel an actually infinite number of past moments to get to the present. So it seems intuitively impossible to reach the present moment from past infinity. But also scientifically, we know that the universe and everything in it is not eternal. Cosmologists have discovered that the universe is in a state of accelerating expansion. So when we look at this in reverse, right, if you take the universe expansion to look like a cone, then you can look at it in reverse as the universe is shrinking back down. And eventually it reaches a point at which it doesn't go any further. And that is the beginning of the universe. This is proven scientifically, and so we have very good scientific reason to believe that the universe is not past eternal. And then finally, theologically or doctrinally, Jains claimed that salvation is attainable through extreme personal effort, right? If you exert enough effort through meditation and getting rid of your attachment to the material world, then you can attain salvation. Excuse me. Biblically, we know this is false. Salvation is a gracious gift from God, received by faith in Jesus. You can't earn salvation by doing good deeds. And we read that in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. And Jesus, who rose from the dead in vindication of his teaching, said, whoever believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. That's John chapter 11, verse 25. Jains also claimed that the ultimate goal is leaving the body behind, right? They want to escape the cycle of rebirth. Well, that means that eventually they just don't want to have a body anymore. But according to the Bible, that is not the goal. We were made to have bodies and are God's image bearers, right? Our being embodied beings and being human beings, we bear the image of God, and that's in Genesis 1. We reflect God's image best when we are the way in which we were designed to be, which is having bodies. And number two, the ultimate goal is not disembodiment, but glorified embodiment. We were meant to have glorified bodies, which are immortal. So we read this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 54, where Paul says that we wait for the perishable to put on imperishable, and for the mortal to put on immortal. And so the goal is not to get rid of our bodies, but to have perfected bodies, or bodies that are immortal. So what's the major lesson here? Well, I think the major lesson to take away from this video is that a worldview or religion or philosophy is only as good as its foundations. And since Jainism is built on foundational errors, it leads to a worldview which doesn't really correspond to reality. And while we can appreciate certain aspects of almost all religions, and I appreciate many aspects of Jainism, we must ultimately put our hope in what is true, and that finds its fullest expression in the person of Jesus Christ. So that's all for today, but I do have a bonus question. So the 9th century Jainist scholar, his name is Jinasena, he said the following regarding the existence of God. Some foolish men declare that Creator made the world. The doctrine that the world was created is ill-advised and should be rejected. If God created the world, where was he before creation? If you say he was transcendent then and needed no support, where is he now? No single being had the skill to make the world, for how can an immaterial God create the material? How could God have made the world without any raw material? If God created the world by an act of will without any raw material, then it is just his will and nothing else. And who will believe this silly stuff? If he created out of love for living things and need of them he made the world, why did he not make creation wholly blissful, free from misfortune? Thus, the doctrine that the world was created by God makes no sense at all. If you were sitting across from Jinasena, how would you respond? Talk to you later.